That's very nice that I have about 10 minutes because I plan to have about 7, so I hope I'll be within, within the limit. Thank you very much for asking me. I would have said this even without Robert Chambers' speech this morning, but it's genuinely a privilege to be speaking to you, and I look forward very much to sharing some of the things that we feel come out of the data about the critical role of ODA and about mobilizing other resources. People have said all through today and in discussions around the global partnership that they recognize that the world is changing and has actually changed, and that we really need international and development cooperation that is fit for the next 15 years and is not predicated on the last 50. And I think there's a lot of consensus around some of the things that that means about investing in global public goods, but also about meeting the minimum requirements of sustaining, achieving and sustaining the eradication of poverty. I think it's quite important in this discussion that we don't get too hung up on what counts or doesn't count as ODA. In my view, there are two fundamental questions about resources that we should try and think about. One is how we target the scarce and precious resource of ODA in order to achieve poverty eradication. And the other is how do we mobilize both more and better resources from the great range and diversity of finance that's now available. So 1995 was the first time that heads of state admitted that the eradication of poverty was possible. 2010, we saw the achievement of the first MDG of halving the proportion of people in extreme poverty. And now we have consensus that the eradication of extreme poverty, of income poverty, is achievable by 2030. I think it's impossible to overstate the significance of this. We've moved from a discussion where eradication of poverty is somehow an aspiration. We put it in the beginning paragraphs of reports. But now we're talking about timetables, plans, options, feasibility. It's a completely different environment and a very, very encouraging one. And furthermore, we're not talking about it as an alternative to other sorts of progress. Achieving the minimum income standard by 2030 for everyone in the world is not an alternative to addressing gender inequality or other forms of deprivation or other types of progress that we want to achieve. It's one very specific goal within that context. So if we're going to say that it's feasible, what do the data say about how feasible it is? Well, it really depends. That grey bar on the right-hand side of the graph there is the range of possibilities depending on different estimates of growth and inequality as to the number of people living below the poverty line in 2030. So it could be about the same, maybe even a little more, or it could be down as low as 100 million people. So policies really matter. Clearly, policies are critically important to our ability to make progress to achieve the eradication of poverty. Policies on equity and growth, particularly domestic policies. But resources matter too. And not only the volume of resources, but the productivity of resources, the quality of what those resources can deliver. Now, we all know, I think, that ODA has gone up over the last 10 years or so. You probably, if you don't know already, I'm sure Eric will say in a moment that last year was a record high year for ODA. I'm privileged to come from a country that has reached the 0.7% target, along with a group of other countries. I think that's a matter of great pride to many people in Britain. But other resources have grown too. So internationally, other resources from the private sector, from FDI, from loans, etc., have increased. But if you then put on top of those domestic resources, you literally can't see ODA because the orange and the red on this projector don't show. But right down at the bottom there, under that orange line, is the ODA. And I'm just checking that's correct. And so the critical question is, how do you lever that amount of money to achieve what it can best achieve? Now, if you look then at the domestic resources that are available, in many of the discussions, I think, over the last year, domestic resources have been seen quite rightly as the spine, as the critical factor in achieving progress. We were staggered when we did these data. If you look at the spending per capita in many countries, it's almost unbelievably low. So 380 million people who are living below the poverty line, living on less than $1.25 a day, are in countries where government expenditure is less than $500 per person per year to do everything, to pay your civil service, to invest in education, to send people to meetings like this, to secure your borders, everything. These are tiny amounts of money. And on any projection, they are inadequate to achieve the eradication of poverty by 2030, let alone achieve all the other areas of social progress that we want to achieve. So what other resources are available to those countries that have very, very low levels of domestic resources? It's a really different picture, depending on which group you're in. So countries with less than $200 per person per year, ODA is the most important resource. For countries between 200 and 500, it's a really significant resource. As countries get better off, the range and diversity of other resources increase. So I think the conclusion from this is, I think we might have skipped a slide there, is that ODA is, if you could go back one, please. No, we have on mine, but not on that one. So there's a clear conclusion from that data, which is that ODA is essential to countries with a high incidence of poverty and low domestic resources. This is not rocket science. I think many of us knew this already, but I think the data is absolutely unequivocal on this. But poverty persists in countries that are better off too, and ODA and international cooperation are needed alongside domestic resources. So if you take India, for example, and you were to rank Indian states alongside countries for the largest numbers of people living in absolute poverty, 11 states of India would be among the top 20 countries for absolute numbers of people living in extreme poverty. So if we're serious about the eradication of poverty, I think we have to look at the relationship between domestic and international resources in order to achieve that. Now, the question on your card, as it were, for this afternoon's session was, how do we get aid to where it's needed? And at the moment, we have a combination of a very, very wide eligibility criteria, lots of countries that are eligible to receive aid, not too much incentive to target. My own view is that wide eligibility, is correct, because in the future, countries will fall into as well as escape out of poverty. It's appropriate that they should be eligible to receive aid. But we need to target the resources much, much better so that they actually focus on extreme poverty. And I think this comes down to some relatively straightforward things. And it perhaps also echoes what Robert Chambers was saying this morning. I think we have to focus on who benefits, not just on which countries, but which parts of society benefit from different investments, and when do we expect that benefit to take place. So a discussion which is focused around, as he was saying, things, is infrastructure more important than education, or is public financial management more important than social protection? It's not a resolvable argument, because you want all of those things. The question is, where do you need to deploy resources in order to get the poorest people access to those services? If we're going to reform aid, then actually for the next 15 years, I don't think that the purpose of aid, which at the moment is a very broad one, economic development and welfare, is sufficient. We need a purpose of aid that is focused on impact on the bottom 20%. And in our big measures of progress, we need to change from looking at GNI and averages to looking at overall well-being of the poorest parts of the population alongside that. And if we're going to achieve social progress, then we need to harness other resources. We also need much, much better data. If you're going to allocate resources effectively, you have to know who is poor, who's moving into poverty, who's moving out of poverty. If you're going to know what works, you have to know these things. And we really don't. So 6 countries in Africa have no survey data at all. Monica Asuna, who was at our side event, who's from the National Treasury in Kenya, was talking about the data they're using being based on 2006 or 2007. 21 countries using data which is more than 7 years old. And even that, even if it were more recent, is not going to be enough because you have huge differences between countries. Some parts of Uganda are equivalent to Turkey. Some parts of Uganda rank 102 out of 104 countries surveyed. So unless we have disaggregated data that shows who is doing well and who is doing badly, we're not going to be able to focus progress. But the big question is not only about how do we use this 7% figure up at the top here of ODA, it's how we harness the 93% of other resources that are available. And we have to get much smarter at it. We're not in a good position to do that. So we talk about FDI, but we don't talk about the outflows of FDI. Almost as much FDI flows out of developing countries as flows into developing countries. Unless we have that data, how do we make a sensible policy about how to use FDI? We need much, much better information about these resources so that they can be used for their strategic advantage. So I think there's a pretty unstoppable logic that emerges from this data. Clearly, we're going to continue to need ODA to eradicate poverty. Clearly, we're going to need better data. And unless we focus on a disaggregated understanding of who is benefiting from different resources, we're not going to be able to allocate these resources efficiently. We need to be able to optimize domestic and international resources working together in order to achieve the twin objectives of no one living below the poverty line in 2030 and progress, universal progress on the global goals. Thanks very much.